The day I pulled that trigger, I had no idea I was setting off a chain reaction that would end a 15-year reign of HOA tyranny. I got hit with a $750 fine for scaring a squirrel with an air rifle. Absolute madness. But Elizabeth Wilson, our power-hungry HOA president, didn't realize she'd just awakened a sleeping giant by invoking an ancient clause buried deep in my property deed. A legal trap that would soon cost her everything. Honestly, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below while I tell you how one small act of garden defense led to an entire neighborhood revolution. The squirrels had been my nemesis since I moved into Pine Ridge Estates 6 months ago. Picture-perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and an overwhelming sense of conformity greeted me daily. But underneath that suburban paradise lurked something darker, a ruthless HOA regime run by a retired mid-level insurance executive with a Napoleon complex. I just didn't know it yet. All I knew at the time was that these damn squirrels were destroying my attempts at growing my own food. When I bought the house, the real estate agent had raved about the well-maintained community and protective covenants that ensured property values stayed high. What she conveniently left out was that those protective covenants filled a 300-page binder of microscopic text governing everything, from the acceptable shade of eggshell white for window trim to the maximum height of garden gnomes, which, by the way, is 0. They're completely banned. The closing attorney slid that binder across the table with an almost apologetic smile. I signed it without reading through it thoroughly. My first mistake in a series of many. Have you tried ultrasonic repellers? Eleanor Winters asked one day over the fence. At 70, she had kind eyes that seemed to observe everything without judgment. The HOA is quite particular about visible deterrence, dear. Eleanor had lived in Pine Ridge since the foundation was poured on the first house. She'd seen 5 HOA presidents come and go. But according to her whispered conversations, none ruled with such obsessive control as Elizabeth Wilson. She measures grass with a ruler, Eleanor once told me, her voice low like the hedges might overhear. Tommy Franklin down the street got fined $125 because his lawn was a 1/4 inch too high on garbage day. I tried everything humane for weeks, live traps, electronic repellers, even those ridiculous owl statues. Nothing worked. Then came that fateful Sunday morning when I watched a particularly bold squirrel demolish my entire tomato trellis. Weeks of work destroyed in minutes. Something in me snapped. I grabbed my old air rifle from the garage, made sure no neighbors were around, and took aim from my back porch. The pellet didn't kill the squirrel, but it definitely scared it off. I thought that was the end of it, until Eleanor appeared at my side fence later that afternoon, looking concerned. "Thomas, I hate to be the bearer of bad news," she said gently, "but I saw what happened this morning. There's a clause in the HOA regulations about hunting or trapping devices. They're quite strict about it." I shrugged it off. "It's just a pellet gun, Eleanor, barely stronger than a toy. I'm just protecting my garden." 24 hours later, an official-looking envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a violation notice with a $750 fine for 2 infractions: unauthorized use of trapping devices and hunting within residential areas. The letter was signed by Elizabeth Wilson, HOA president, and there was a note in the margin: "Further violations will result in escalated penalties." "This is ridiculous," I muttered, flipping through the massive HOA handbook I'd received when purchasing the house. Sure enough, buried in Appendix C, Section 27, Subsection 4, was a prohibition against any devices designed for hunting, trapping, or deterring wildlife through forceful means. The clause was wedged between rules about approved bird bath designs and restrictions on wind chimes. No wonder I missed it. The next morning, I marched straight to the HOA office, a converted bedroom in Elizabeth's oversized colonial at the entrance to the subdivision. Her secretary, a woman who looked perpetually disappointed, reluctantly announced me. Elizabeth's house stood apart from others, not just in size, but in the liberties it took with the very rule she enforced so zealously on everyone else. Her garden featured exotic plants not on the approved list. Her mailbox was slightly larger than regulation allowed. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle, but then again, it didn't need to be. When you write and enforce the rules, you can always find exceptions for yourself. Elizabeth was exactly what you'd expect, a 58-year-old woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a perfectly pressed pantsuit and pearls that looked too heavy to be comfortable. Her office walls were covered with framed compliance certificates and photos of her shaking hands with local politicians. "Mr. Bennett," she said without standing. "What can I do for you?" I placed the violation notice on her immaculate desk. $7.50 for scaring a squirrel? This seems excessive. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Rules are rules, Mr. Bennett. We take wildlife protection very seriously here in Pine Ridge." Wildlife protection? That squirrel was destroying my garden. "I've tried every humane method." "Perhaps gardening isn't for you, then," she interrupted coolly. "Many residents find our community landscaping service quite adequate for their needs. No need for individual expressions." She practically spat out those last words. The conversation deteriorated quickly. Every point I made was countered with a reference to some obscure rule or community standard. It became clear this wasn't about squirrels or air rifles. This was about power. Elizabeth Wilson ran Pine Ridge Estates like her personal fiefdom, and I had committed the cardinal sin of not falling in line. "Mr. Bennett," she said as I turned to leave, her voice dripping with condescension, "at Pine Ridge, we have traditions and rules. If you don't like them, perhaps this isn't the place for you." I paused at the door, my knuckles white on the knob. "Is that a threat, Miss Wilson?" Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Just an observation. Welcome to Pine Ridge Estates." Walking back home, I was furious. $750 felt like highway robbery. But something told me this fine was just the beginning. What Elizabeth Wilson didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. After our confrontation, I decided to do some digging. I spent the evening combing through HOA documents, highlighting vague clauses that could be interpreted multiple ways. There were dozens of restrictions that could be selectively enforced, depending on who was in favor and who wasn't. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA. This was systematic control. My grandfather used to say the devil lives in the details of contracts, and the Pine Ridge HOA covenant was the devil's playground. Phrases like reasonable aesthetic standards, community character, and appropriate modifications appeared throughout, all subjective terms that meant whatever Elizabeth wanted them to mean on any given day. The document was designed not for clarity, but for flexibility of enforcement, a dictator's dream constitution. Even more concerning were the penalty provisions. First offenses typically carried monetary fines, but repeat violations could lead to property liens, revoked community privileges, and in extreme cases, forced compliance through contractor intervention, all costs billed to the homeowner. In essence, once Elizabeth decided to target someone, she had all the tools she needed to make their life miserable. The next day, I took my laptop to the local coffee shop to escape the confines of Pine Ridge for a few hours. I was deep into researching HA legal precedents when someone tapped my shoulder. "You're the new guy in 412, Pine Hollow Drive, right?" A woman about my age with bright eyes and a press badge dangling from her neck stood beside my table. "I'm Olivia Ramirez. I live 3 doors down from you." She gestured to the empty chair. "Thomas Bennett. Nice to meet a neighbor who isn't leaving violation notices on my door." Olivia laughed, then lowered her voice. "I heard about your run-in with the Panton police. Join the club. I got hit with a $500 fine last year for sunflowers that were excessively tall, according to the garden height restrictions." Panton police? That's what some of us call Wilson and her round table. They walk around with actual color swatches hanging from their necks, making sure everyone's exterior paint and flowers match the approved palette. She rolled her eyes. Elizabeth gives them titles based on color accuracy, from medium vivid to full pastel. We spent the next hour swapping HOA horror stories. Olivia, a freelance journalist, had been collecting accounts of Elizabeth's reign for a potential article but kept hitting a wall of silence. Everyone was afraid. Cross Elizabeth, and suddenly you're facing violations for infractions nobody else gets cited for. As we talked, other patrons occasionally glanced our way. An older man at the next table leaned over quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "I used to live in Pine Ridge, but sold my house at a loss 3 years ago. Couldn't take it anymore after they fined me for having the wrong shade of beige curtains." Beige, there were 17 approved shades, and apparently mine was desert calm when it should have been sandstone whisper. That opened the floodgates. 2 other former Pine Ridge residents joined our conversation, each with their own tale of HOA persecution. One woman had been fined repeatedly because her disabled mother's medical van didn't meet aesthetic standards when parked in the driveway. Another fought for 6 months to get approval for a small ramp for his aging father, only to face continuous compliance checks afterward. "It's like a little dictatorship," one of them said. And the worst part? Most people just roll over and accept it because they're afraid their property values will drop if they make waves. When I returned home that evening, something fell off. I did a quick walk around my property and found a broken bag of fertilizer in my garden bed. Upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't the organic stuff I used. This had been laced with herbicide. Several of my plants were already wilting. Tucked into the soil was a small note: "Newcomers should know their place." I immediately installed security cameras around my property. 2 nights later, they captured footage of a middle-aged woman in a Pine Ridge Estates polo shirt, one of Elizabeth's inner circle, sneaking into my yard before dawn. Not enough for a clear ID, but clearly not random vandalism. The violation notice wasn't just about a squirrel or an air rifle. It was a warning shot in a long-running campaign of neighborhood control. My refusal to pay the fine and show proper deference marked me as a troublemaker. And the herbicide-laced fertilizer was their way of letting me know resistance would be met with escalation. Olivia introduced me to William Granger, a 62-year-old former HOA board member living in the quietest corner of the neighborhood. His once beautiful Victorian home now showed signs of neglect: peeling paint, overgrown bushes, a general air of defeat. "I tried to stand up to Elizabeth 6 years ago," he told me as we sat on his back porch, far from prying eyes. "I found irregularities in the HOA financial reports, expensive landscaping contracts going to her brother-in-law's company, administrative fees that couldn't be accounted for. When I raised concerns, Elizabeth and her cronies came after me with everything they had." He described how they changed rules specifically targeting his property, restrictions on Victorian-style homes that didn't apply to anyone else, limitations on color schemes, rules about the type of mailbox permitted on his street. They made it impossible for me to sell without taking a massive loss. Who wants to buy a house with custom restrictions no other property has? "Didn't you try to fight it legally?" I asked, watching a pair of cardinals land on his neglected bird feeder. William gave a hollow laugh. "With what money? I spent $20,000 on lawyers before realizing I could not spend the HOA, which had access to all our dues, to fight back. Eventually, I had to give up. My wife couldn't take the stress. She moved out last year. Now I just keep my head down and try to avoid their attention." As I listened to William's story, a pattern emerged. Elizabeth targeted anyone who questioned her authority, especially newcomers who hadn't yet been indoctrinated into the Pine Ridge way. She isolated them, made examples of them, and either forced them to submit or drove them out. "She's been doing this for 15 years, he said, handing me a thick folder of old HOA documents. "If you're serious about fighting back, you need to understand how she built this empire." Later that night, as I flipped through the yellowed pages of HOA minutes and amendments, I discovered something unexpected. Elizabeth's own property had significant legal issues she apparently didn't know about. The original land survey showed discrepancies that could prove very interesting indeed. A powerful thunderstorm hit Pine Ridge the following weekend, bringing down tree limbs and scattering debris across the neighborhood. Walking home from my morning coffee run, I noticed Eleanor struggling to clear fallen bricks from her backyard patio. Without hesitation, I cut through her side gate and offered to help. "You're too kind, Tomas," she said, directing me to a pile of bricks that had tumbled from her garden wall. Most young people wouldn't bother with an old woman's troubles. As we worked together clearing the debris, Eleanor shared stories about Pine Ridge from decades past, before Elizabeth's reign. "This used to be a real community," she said wistfully. "People helped each other. Children played in the streets. We had differences, of course, but we resolved them like neighbors, not adversaries." While stacking the fallen bricks, I noticed several old newspaper clippings protected in plastic sleeves tucked into a garden storage box. Eleanor saw my curiosity and smiled. "I keep records of everything. Old habits from my court clerk days. Those are articles about Pine Ridge from the 1980s when this was still mostly undeveloped land." She pulled out one yellowed clipping showing a large group of people holding signs that read, "Preserve our hunting heritage" and "Land rights are human rights." The photo was dated May 1989, she explained. There was quite a battle when the developers first came. This area had been hunting grounds for generations. The compromise was that certain traditional rights would be preserved in the deeds even as the houses were built. Most people have forgotten that history now. Helping Eleanor finish the cleanup, I felt a new connection, not just to her, but to the land itself. This place had stories and fights that predated Elizabeth Wilson and her color-coded minions by decades. The deeper we dug into Elizabeth Wilson's HOA operation, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about squirrels or air rifles. It was a sophisticated system of neighborhood control that bordered on corruption. She had spent 15 years perfecting her methods, and now we were determined to understand every piece of the puzzle. The most frustrating part was realizing how many residents simply accepted her rule as the price of maintaining property values. Olivia called it the frog-in-the-pot phenomenon. If you turn up the heat slowly enough, people don't realize they're being cooked until it's too late. Elizabeth didn't impose strict rules all at once. She added them gradually, year after year, until suddenly, everyone was living under dozens of arbitrary restrictions with no memory of life before them. Jennifer's legal research uncovered something huge. In the town archives, she found a petition from the 1990s where residents had fought to preserve traditional hunting rights. There was even an inscription on a large rock at the entrance of our subdivision, "Preserve our right to hunt, 1989. This wasn't just about my personal fight anymore. It was about restoring rights that had been systematically stripped away over time. Article 214.7 of Minnesota state law was a game changer. Jennifer explained during one of our basement strategy sessions that the law explicitly states that traditional hunting rights for pest control on private property cannot be restricted by non-governmental organizations like HOAs. That meant Elizabeth couldn't legally penalize me for exercising a right protected by state law. This law had been established during a time when rural areas were rapidly developing into suburbs. Longtime residents pushed back against losing their traditional land use rights, and the compromise was this statute, ensuring that even as communities urbanized, certain historical practices remained protected. It was a perfect example of the tension between development and heritage, and in this case, the law came down firmly on the side of heritage. Meanwhile, Olivia's investigative work revealed a disturbing pattern. Through interviews with former residents who had moved away, she identified Elizabeth's methodology: target homeowners with particularly desirable properties, harass them with selective enforcement of rules, and pressure them into selling, often below market value. Then, mysteriously, those homes would be purchased by people connected to Elizabeth or her inner circle. "It's brilliant in a twisted way," Jennifer observed, spreading photos of former residents across my dining table. "Look at these properties, all premium lots, now owned by either Elizabeth's relatives or business associates." It was completely legal on the surface, but ethically reprehensible. Elizabeth wasn't technically doing anything criminal, just systematically abusing a system she controlled to her personal advantage. One morning, I found an anonymous invitation in my mailbox asking me to meet with concerned conservative residents at an address on the other side of town. Something felt off about it. I showed it to Eleanor, who immediately recognized the handwriting as belonging to Deborah, one of Elizabeth's most loyal board members. "It's a trap," Eleanor warned. "They want to get you somewhere private where they can record you saying something they can use against you." Elizabeth did the same thing to William before his financial dispute went public. Her insight proved invaluable. She had been observing Elizabeth's tactics for years, quietly documenting every abuse of power. "People underestimate old ladies," she told me with a wink. "We become practically invisible, which makes us excellent observers." Eleanor had attended every HOA meeting for 20 years, recording inconsistencies and abuses of power. She'd been waiting for someone who might put that information to good use. My security cameras later captured footage of an HOA board member measuring my fence at 5 a.m., presumably looking for violations. I installed additional cameras and motion-activated lights, turning my home into a minor fortress. The psychological toll was significant. I started second-guessing everything about my property, worried any minor deviation might give Elizabeth more ammunition. William confirmed that was exactly her strategy. "She wants you constantly on edge," he explained. "It's easier to control people who are afraid. That's why I finally gave up. The mental stress was destroying my health." He also shared another crucial piece of information. Years ago, Elizabeth had negotiated with a development company interested in buying several Pine Ridge properties to build luxury condos. The deal fell through when certain homeowners, including the previous owner of my house, refused to sell. The development company was partially owned by Elizabeth's brother-in-law. During one of our meetings, Olivia noticed something odd. The community park seemed smaller than on the original plans, especially near Elizabeth's property. We examined satellite images and saw discrepancies between current boundaries and the original development plans. Something was definitely off, particularly around Elizabeth's backyard, where she built her swimming pool 3 years ago. What we couldn't determine from aerial images was whether the encroachment was intentional or due to poor surveying. We decided to hold on to that info, possibly using it as leverage later. Eleanor provided us with a collection of old HOA meeting minutes she had meticulously preserved. They revealed that Elizabeth had deliberately modified hunting and trapping regulations after learning some residents were former hunters. She targeted those rules specifically to exert control. "She's particularly ruthless about enforcing rules she created herself," Eleanor noted. "It's personal for her, a way of demonstrating her authority. The rules that existed before her time, she's more flexible about. It's all about ego." Our biggest breakthrough came when Jennifer compiled all our legal findings. The loophole we discovered wasn't just a technicality, it was a powerful override mechanism buried in the original land deed. By prohibiting traditional hunting rights protected by state law, Elizabeth had unknowingly triggered a clause that could undermine her entire authority structure. "Look at this," Jennifer said, highlighting a section of the original property transfer document. It states that any attempt to restrict traditional hunting rights shall trigger a comprehensive review of all governing regulations. Essentially, by issuing me that violation, Elizabeth activated a trap hidden in the deed itself, a trap that could force the entire HOA rulebook to be reevaluated. We began calling it the Counterstrike Clause, a legal time bomb that had been waiting decades to go off. "It's like finding a secret weapon in a video game," I said, reading through the clause again. "Hidden in plain sight all these years." "More like a nuclear option," Jennifer cautioned. "This will escalate the conflict significantly. Once you invoke this clause, Elizabeth will come at you with everything she's got." "Are you prepared for that?" As we pieced together our findings, a complete picture emerged. Elizabeth wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running a sophisticated scheme to control property values and acquisitions throughout Pine Ridge estates. My simple act of shooting a pellet at a squirrel had unwittingly threatened her entire operation by activating long-forgotten legal provisions. Now, the question was how to use this information most effectively. Confronting Elizabeth directly would give her time to cover her tracks or escalate her harassment. We needed a strategy that would expose her abuses while protecting ourselves from retaliation. Little did we know Elizabeth was already planning her next move against me, one that would push our conflict to a breaking point. Elizabeth wasn't a woman who took threats to her authority lightly. As our investigation deepened, she clearly sensed something was off. I noticed her silver Lexus driving past my house more frequently, slowing to a crawl as she stared at my property with undisguised contempt. This psychological warfare had begun. One evening, my doorbell rang around 9:30. Two police officers stood on my porch, expressions professionally neutral. "Mr. Bennett, we need to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed." According to the report, I had allegedly threatened an HOA board member with physical harm if they didn't back off about my violations. The accusation was completely fabricated. I spent the next 4 hours at the station answering questions and providing character references before they finally accepted my side of the story. One officer admitted off the record, "We get a lot of HOA disputes, but rarely do they escalate to filing false police reports." "Someone really doesn't like you, sir." Exhausted and angry, I returned home after midnight to find something that made my blood run cold. My front lawn had been vandalized. Dead patches of grass formed giant letters spelling out "Violator" across the entire yard. The chemical herbicide had worked quickly, killing the grass down to the roots. My security cameras had been spray-painted black shortly before the incident, leaving me with no evidence of who had done it. Standing in the glow of my porch light, staring at the destruction, something inside me crumbled. I'd moved to Pine Ridge seeking peace and community after years of military service and corporate stress. Instead, I'd found myself in a bizarre suburban war with a petty dictator wielding unexpected power. For the first time, I seriously considered cutting my losses, selling the house, and moving somewhere, anywhere. The next morning, Olivia arrived with coffee and determination. "Don't you dare give up now," she said, surveying the damage. That's exactly what she wants. "I've got something that might help." She had found a former employee of that development company willing to talk about their dealings with Elizabeth. Her encouragement helped, but my resolve wasn't fully restored until later that day, when I was going through my grandfather's old files. I discovered a case marked with an asterisk, Pine Ridge Estates vs. Historical Preservation Society, 2008. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. I drove to my grandfather's old law firm, where Martin Goldstein, his former colleague and now senior partner, recognized me immediately. "Thomas Bennett, you look just like your grandfather in his younger days. What brings you here?" When I showed him the case file, his eyes widened. "This was one of your grandfather's favorite cases. A real David versus Goliath situation, a homeowner fighting to preserve agricultural land rights against an overreaching HOA. Your grandfather was particularly proud of this one," Martin explained, pulling the full case records. He successfully defended a Pine Ridge homeowner against HOA restrictions by invoking historical land use protections, the very same protections now potentially applicable to your situation. The judge had established a clear precedent. HOA regulations cannot supersede historical land use rights established in the original property deed. Martin pointed to the ruling. Your grandfather called it the counterstrike clause, a legal trap that activates when HOAs overstep their boundaries. I left the law office with copies of the full case file and a renewed sense of purpose. Elizabeth Wilson hadn't just picked a fight with the wrong person. She'd picked a fight with the wrong family. My grandfather's legal legacy had provided exactly the ammunition I needed. That feeling of triumph was short-lived. When I reached the parking lot, I discovered my car had been vandalized. Spray paint across the driver's side spelled out, "Move out." The message couldn't have been clearer. This was no longer about HOA violations or community standards. This was personal. Standing beside my defaced vehicle, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and frustration that had been building for weeks crystallized into cold, focused resolve. Elizabeth Wilson wanted war, fine. But it wouldn't be the kind of war she was used to winning, not through intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. This would be a battle of legal precision and public exposure, the kind my grandfather had taught me how to fight. I took pictures of the vandalism, filed another police report, and drove my spray-painted car straight through Pine Ridge Estates with my windows down, making sure everyone saw what their HOA president's tactics really looked like. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Let them wonder what was coming next. Because what was coming next would shake the foundations of Elizabeth's carefully constructed kingdom. I had discovered the trap hidden in the property deed, what my grandfather had called the counterstrike clause. And tomorrow, Elizabeth Wilson would learn what it means to bring trouble to your doorstep.